In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural concrete material, and if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the description. So after I show you how to create the procedural material, we'll be joining it together into this node group so we can customize the look of the material. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material, and then we also have this detail value if you want to turn the detail down, and then we also have this roughness value of the material, so I like to keep it really rough because it is a dry, rough concrete. And then we have three different colors. So we have color 1, so you can see I can make it lighter if I want to, or darker. We also have color 2, and then we also have color 3. And then we also have the crack scale. So if I turn this way down, there's only a few cracks and they're really big. Or if I turn the cracks up, there's a lot more. Now, if I turn up the cracks darkness, you'll be able to see the cracks a bit better. So I can turn up this cracks darkness, and now there's more darkness in the middle of the cracks. And now I can change the crack scale. But I like to keep the cracks pretty subtle, so I'm going to turn them down a bit. However, there also is a cracks thickness value, so you can make it more thin, or you can turn this down and make the cracks a bit thicker if you want to. And then we also have the detail of the crack. So I like to keep it pretty detailed. And then we have some different bump strengths. So the concrete bump strength. We also just have the cracks bump strength. So if you want the cracks to go back into the mesh more, you can. And then we also have the chunks bump strength, which are just some little chunks which are broken out of the concrete. And then there's just this extra bump strength, which is going to give it some more surface detail. So if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials, preset up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more materials, you can check out my procedural material playlist here on YouTube. And if you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube, some great ways that you can do that is by joining the YouTube memberships by clicking on that join button. And when you join the YouTube memberships, you'll get some cool perks here on YouTube and you'll be supporting the channel monthly. You can also use the super thanks feature to send me a little tip if you enjoyed the video. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I wanted to preview this on a sphere so I can kind of see the shading of it. So I'm going to add an icosphere, and then right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I turn the subdivisions up to 6. That way it's nice and smooth and round, and I'll close the icosphere settings. Let's use the object context menu and shade the object smooth, and then I'm going to scale it down by a 0.2, and I'll hit Ctrl A and apply the scale, so that's a better size when modeling to the real life scale in Blender. And then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera right at the object. And if you select the camera and click over here to go to the object data properties, I turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom the camera in a little bit. And also here on the output properties, I set the X and Y resolution to the same value, so it is a square image. Now, as for the lighting, I added a few different area lights. So I added this area light back here, and this area light kind of adds like a rim light. You can see there's kind of like a little bit of brightness there on the back. So for this light, if you go to the light settings, I turn the power up to 40 and I set the shape to disk. And then this other area light right here, this is a really small one. I set the power to 20 and it's a lot closer, and the shape is also set to disk. And then to get some nice realistic lighting or reflections in the world, I added this Machine Shop 02 HDRI from polyhaven.com. So the link is in the video description, and I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot next to color and click on environment texture, and then just click on the open button to open up the HDRI. Now also what I'm going to do is go to the render properties, and I'm going to scroll down here to the film tab, and I'm going to check mark the transparent button just so that the background is transparent, so it'll still light the scene but it's not as distracting. And then also right here on the color management, I'm going to be using the view transform of Filmic, and I'll set the look to very high contrast so it pops out the colors and makes things look more contrasted and saturated. So I'm just going to close the side panel now. So I'm going to go to the shading workspace by clicking up here on shading. So I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'll go into the rendered view. So I'll select the object and let's click on new to add a new material, and I'll just rename this to concrete. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video, so if you don't have that enabled, you can click on edit and you can go to the preferences and then just go to the add-ons tab, and here on the search, just search for Node and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So let's first start by creating the base color. So to create the base color, I'm going to start by searching for a Voronoi texture, and let's Control-Shift select the Voronoi to preview it. And with the Voronoi texture selected, I'll hit Control-T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So we'll put the object into the vector. Now I do want to keep my nodes nicely organized because the setup will get a little bit big. So I'm going to box select these two nodes. and I'll hit Control J to join them together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to give this a label, and I'm just going to call this mapping and hit enter. So these frames are totally optional, you don't need to add them, but I like to add them just to keep the nodes nicely organized. So now let's change the settings of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to change the scale to 300, and I'll turn the detail to 10, and then I will leave the other settings how they are. So if you kind of zoom in here, we have some nice little spots there that are detailed. Now I want to mix this together with a noise texture, so let's search for a noise texture, and we can drop it here underneath the Voronoi, and then let's plug the same mapping vector into the vector of the noise texture. We can Control-Shift select the noise texture to preview it, and I can change the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 200, and I'll turn the detail up to 10, and then also on the distortion, I'll turn this to like a 0.1, just so it has a tiny little bit of distortion. So now to mix these two nodes together, what I can do is hold down the Shift key and select both of them, and then I can hit Control 0. And Control 0 is going to add this mix color, so it's going to mix them both together. And here on the mix factor, I'm going to turn this up to a 0.8. So if you turn it all the way up to 1, it's using the noise. If you turn it all the way to 0, it's using the Voronoi. So I'm turning it to 0.8, so it's mostly the noise, but it'll just have a little bit of the Voronoi mixed in. So let's box select these nodes, and I'll hit Control J to add a frame, and I will select the frame and hit F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to call this color. So now what I want to do is make it a bit more contrasted, and then we're going to add the base colors. So I'm first going to search for a color ramp to make it more contrasted. So we'll drop it here and stick it inside the frame. Let's just zoom in here. And I'm going to drag the black tab over kind of like that, so it's a bit more contrasted. And now to create the custom colors, I'm going to select the mix here. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate and drop it here after this color ramp. We want the color to go into the factor. So now that it's going into the factor, the white and dark values are going to determine what will be color A and color B. So for color A, I'm going to make this a pretty dark gray color, and you can punch in the same hex value. That is 3C, 3C, 3C if you want to use the same hex code. And then here on color B, this is going to be slightly brighter to add some variation. And if you want to use the same color, you can punch in the hex code of 525252. So now let's put the mix result into the base color, and I'll Control-Shift select the principled shader, and there we go. Now the color is on the shader. And then I do also want to change the roughness, so I'm going to turn this roughness up to a 0.75 on the shader, so it's quite a bit more rough. Now I also want to mix in a few blotchy areas where it's just slightly darker. So what I'm going to do is search for another noise texture and drop it here into the color, and we'll put it here above the Voronoi. And the mapping can go into the mapping vector. And let's just preview the noise texture, and I can change the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 30, and I'll turn the detail up to 10, and then I'll also turn the distortion to just like a 0.1, so there's a tiny bit of distortion. So now to make it more contrasted, I can search for a color ramp, and let's drop this here. And let's not change the color ramp quite yet because I want to show you what it's doing. So I'm going to drag these nodes back, and now what I want to do is add another mix color to mix this color ramp into the base color. So we'll select the mix, and we'll duplicate it and drop it here, and this mix result can go into color A, and we can now take the noise texture here and the color ramp, which is on the top, and we can put that into the factor. So now let's Control-Shift select the mix to preview it. And then I want to make this an even darker color, so it looks kind of like there's some splotchy dark colors. So here on color B, I'm going to be using this really dark color, and the hex code is going to be 373737. So now if I go back here to the color ramp, I can drag these around, and you can see as they're closer together, there's going to be a lot more contrast. So I can kind of see those better. So for the contrast, I'm going to drag the black tab to about here, and then I'll drag the white tab over to about there. So there's just a few more blotchy areas here and there, maybe even drag it back a little bit so it's not quite as contrasted. So let's now Control-Shift select the principled shader, and that's just going to add a slight variation to the color. So I now want to create the cracks texture, so we're going to do that right down here. So I'm going to search for two nodes, a Voronoi texture and also a noise texture. So I'll drop the noise down here, and I'm first going to plug the mapping vector into the vector of the Voronoi, and let's just preview the Voronoi. So to make it look like cracks, I'm going to take the F1, and I'm going to change that to distance to edge, and now if I turn up the scale, you can see there's some little cracks here. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 6, and I'll turn the detail to 10, so it's pretty detailed, and I'll keep the other settings how they are. So now I want to make it look more noisy and random, so I'm going to drop the noise texture here in between the mapping and the Voronoi. So because it's going through the vector, vector, it's going to distort the placement of the Voronoi texture. So we can change the settings of the noise. So I'll turn the scale to 3, and I'll turn the detail to 10, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now you can see the cracks look very wobbly and detailed and noisy. So it's way too gray right now, and I want it to be very clear where the cracks are. So I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put this here after the Voronoi. And I can now just drag the white tab way over here, and I'm going to drag it really, really close so it's really contrasted, and now you can clearly see where the cracks are. And later on in the custom node group, I want to be able to change the size of the cracks. So if I just search for a hue saturation value and put this after the Voronoi, we now have the value, which is going to make it lighter and darker. So that's going to change the size of the cracks, because where the dark parts are, that's where you'll be able to see the cracks more. So we'll use that later in the custom node group. So we'll box select these nodes, and we will join them into a frame, and we'll add a label, and I'm just going to call this cracks to keep things really nicely organized. So now what I want to do is put them here into the principled shader. So I'll Control Shift select the principled shader, and then what I want to do is add the color ramp color into the normal to give it some bump. Now you can see that's not working, it just looks really weird. That's because we need to convert the color data into normal data that the shader can use. So to do this, we are going to search for a bump node, and we'll put the bump node between the color ramp and the principled shader. And the normal needs to be going into the height value to convert it to bump data, so now you can see those cracks are quite strong. But I'm going to turn the strength way down to like a 0.1 so the cracks are much more subtle. Now what I also want to do is mix in the cracks color into the base color here. So to do this, I'm going to search for another mix color and drop it here. And I'm going to take the cracks color and we're going to put that into color B. And then we're going to take this mix result and put that into color A. Now on the mix type here, I'm going to change this to a multiply instead. And now I can turn the factor way down to a 0.1. So now you can see as I turn up the factor more and more, those cracks are darker and darker. So if you want to, you can hit Control J and press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this add cracks so that I know what everything is doing. So now what I want to do is take the add cracks result here, and I want to put that into the bump as well. So we'll box select these nodes and drag them back here. And then I'm going to duplicate this bump node and drop it here. So now this multiply here, the result can go into the height value. And then this bump normal can go into the normal because it's already been converted to normal data. So that's how you can mix multiple bump maps together. So now I can change the strength and you can see it's making the concrete look really bumpy. But I'm going to keep it at a very small number of just a 0.1. So it's pretty smooth on the surface. So now what I want to do is just add 2 more layers of bump to make it look really detailed. So what I'm going to do is search for a noise texture. We'll drop this down here, and the mapping vector can go into the vector of the noise. And let's Control Shift select the noise to preview it. And I'll change the scale to 50 so it's a bit bigger. And I'll turn the detail up to 10 so it's pretty detailed. And I'll keep the other settings how they are. So then to make it more contrasted, I'm going to search for a color ramp and drop this right here. And then before we change the color ramp settings, I'm going to plug it into the bump. So what I'm going to do is select this bump and I'll duplicate it and drop it here after the first one. And just make sure the normal is going into the normal. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So let's take this noise texture here on this color ramp. We'll put the color into the extra height value, and then I can Control Shift select the principled shader. And I can drag up that strength value if I want to make it more strong, but I'm going to leave it at a 0.1. So now if I go back here to the noise texture in the color ramp, I can change the contrast of the color ramp to change how it looks. So what I'm actually going to do is flip these 2 values. So I'll put the white here and the black over here. And if I Control Shift select the color ramp to preview it, you can see by switching the values, I can now drag the black tab over here and the white tab kind of over here. So now it's mostly black, but there's just some little white chunks. So I'm just going to drag that to about there and that to about there. So now there's going to be some little chunks in the material. So if I Control Shift select the principled shader, I can turn up the strength here, and you can see there's just going to be some little chunks. Now the problem with this is that the chunks look like they're popping out instead of caving back in. So I can just click on the invert button, and now if I turn up the strength, it looks like there's some little chunks just being hit out of the concrete. Almost like a hammer kind of banged some chunks out of the concrete. Now I do also want to add one more bump, which is just going to be a little bit of detail over the entire surface. So we'll just select this bump node and we'll duplicate it and drop it right here after these ones. And then I can select both of these textures and I'll hit Control Shift D. So Control Shift D will duplicate the nodes, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up. And I'll Control Shift select the color ramp to preview it. And I'm going to take this color ramp and drag the black tab right over here and drag the white tab over a little bit so it's not quite as contrasted. And then I can also change the settings of this bottom noise. So I'm going to turn the scale to 40 and I will leave all the other settings how they are. So now this color imp color, that is going to go into the height value. So we'll put the color here into the height value of this bump, and I'll Control Shift select the principled shader. So now if I turn up this final bump, it's just going to add a little bit of detail over the entire surface. So we can box select these nodes, add them into a frame, and let's just compress them so they're kind of pushed together. And we can add a label, and I'm just going to call this bump. And then if we go down to the bottom ones right here, we can box select these, hit Control J, hit F2 to add a label, and I can just call this maybe bump or bump textures. So that is it for the procedural material. So let's now join it together into a custom node group so you can customize the material and it's more useful to use in projects. So I'm going to box select everything except the material output, so all those nodes, and I'll hit Control G to join it together into a node group. And I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group, and I'll just drag the node group right over here so it's close to the material output, and I can just drag it out to make it bigger, and then I can copy the material name and I can paste the material name here into the node group. So let's hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And if you go to the group tabs and go to the group sockets, I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to call it shader. So outside the node group, you can see that is called shader, and I just like how that looks a lot better. So now if I go over here to this side, we have this group input, and we can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So this mapping node here is plugged up to all the textures. So this scale value will control the size of the entire material. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket, and then if we click on the scale, you can see it's 3 values, but I just want to make it 1 value. So we'll take the type here, and instead of vector, we're going to change it to float, so it is 1 number value. Then I need to turn the default value to 1, and then if I hit tab to go outside the node group, let's turn the scale back to 1. So now that'll control the size of the entire material at once. So let's hit tab to go back into the node group. Then I want to control the detail values. So if I drag the group input right up here, we have these 3 detail values, which are all the same. They're all a detail of 10. So I'll put the detail into this socket, and then these other 2 detail values, I'm going to put them into the same exact socket. And then also I'll drag the group input right down here to these bumps, and we can put this detail into the same socket and this detail into the same socket. Now I'm not going to add the details for the cracks because that's going to be a separate detail value that we'll add. So if I go outside the node group, this detail now is going to change the size of all of those detail values at once, but just not the cracks. So we'll go back into the node group. Then I want to control the roughness of the material, so let's drag the group input way over here, and I'm going to put the roughness into the extra socket, and it's called roughness. Let's also drag the group input right back up here, and then I can add in all the colors. So I'll put color A into the extra socket, and color B, and then also color B right here. And then I can just rename these, so color 1, and then also color 2, and then this one I'll rename to color 3. Then I want to control the scale of the cracks, so let's drag the group input right down here, and we'll put the group input right behind the cracks here. And you can see if I change this scale value, that's going to change the size of the cracks. So I'll put the noise scale into the extra socket, we'll double click on this, and I'm just going to rename that to crack scale. Then I want to control the cracks darkness, so if I go right over here up to this add cracks, we have this multiply here with the factor, and that's going to make it darker. So we'll put the factor into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to cracks darkness. Then I want to control the thickness of the cracks. So this hue saturation value is going to make it lighter and darker, so it's going to make the cracks thicker. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and this one I'm going to rename to cracks thickness. And then finally, I want to control the detail of the cracks. So I'll put this detail into the extra socket, and then this detail, put that into the same exact socket. And then this one I can rename to cracks detail. And then I want to control the bump strengths. So if I just drag the group input right over here, this first bump strength is just the concrete. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket. Let's just rename this. And I'm going to call this one concrete bump strength. I can also drag this down here to make this a bit bigger. Then this one here, that's the cracks. So I'll put the strength into the extra socket. And this one, I'm going to rename this one to cracks bump strength. Then this one here are those little chunky pieces, so the chunks. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket. And this one I'm going to rename to chunks bump strength. And then the final one here is just a little bit of extra detail if you want to add it. So I'll put the strength into the extra socket. And this one I'm going to call extra bump strength. So I will hit the N key to close the side panel. Let's drag the group input right over here at the very starting, drag the group output right up there, and then I can hit the tab key to outside the node group, and I'll just save the project. So we can now just review the final material and make sure it's working correctly. So we have the scale value, so you can change the size of the entire material. We also have the detail value, and then we also have the roughness of the material, but since it's concrete, I like to keep it pretty rough. And then we have a few different colors for the concrete. So for example, if you want to make the concrete look a little bit dirty, you could maybe make this like a dark brown color, and now it looks like there's some little dark brown spots on the concrete. So you can do that if you want to. There's also the crack scale, and then also the darkness of the cracks, so you can make it darker and more visible, and then also the thickness of the cracks. We also have the detail of the cracks as well, and then we have the concrete bump strength. We also have the cracks bump strength. We also have the chunks bump strength, and then finally the extra bump strength. So that's how you create this procedural concrete material in Blender. So I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material to add into your projects, then you can purchase it with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And if you like using procedural materials in your projects, you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials and they're pre-set up in Blender's asset browser. So if you just install the product as an asset library in Blender's user preferences, then you can just drag and drop all the procedural materials into your projects to quickly add materials to your 3D scenes. And all of the materials come as these custom node groups, so you can customize the look of the material. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.